"You mean nothing to me," Henry Coldwell said, loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear. Margaret Ashford stood frozen, her gloved hands pressed together so tightly that her knuckles ached beneath the silk. The music had not stopped. The candles still burned steady in their brass holders. But for Margaret, the entire room had gone silent, as though every sound had been swallowed by the weight of those 5 words. Henry did not even look ashamed. He turned, smiling, toward Louisa, who stood a few steps away in a gown the color of ripe peaches, her cheeks flushed with the thrill of being chosen in front of everyone. Louisa did not seem to understand what her sister had just lost. She only saw the handsome captain reaching for her hand, bowing his head as though she were the only woman in Yardworth Hall. Margaret felt the eyes of the room turn toward her, curious, pitying, some even amused. She had spent 3 months believing that Henry's attention meant something. He had walked with her in the garden. He had sent her a note asking after her father's health. She had allowed herself, foolishly, to hope. Now that hope lay shattered on the ballroom floor, and everyone had watched it break. She did not cry. She would not give this room the satisfaction of her tears. Instead, she lifted her chin, the way her father had taught her to do when facing hardship, and turned to walk toward the terrace doors, where the night air might cool the heat rising in her face. It was then that she noticed him. Across the room, near the tall windows, stood a man she had seen only twice before, and always from a distance. Edmund Whitlock, Duke of Yardworth, was not a man who attended balls for pleasure. He came, people said, because duty required it, and he left as soon as duty allowed. He was tall, dressed in dark blue that made him look severe among the brighter colors of the other gentlemen, and his face carried none of the polite, empty smiles that filled the rest of the room. He was watching her. Not with pity, not with the amused curiosity of the others. He watched her the way a man might watch something he did not yet understand but found worth understanding. Margaret held his gaze for only a moment before she looked away, embarrassed that anyone, let alone the Duke of Yardworth, had witnessed her humiliation. She continued toward the terrace, slipping through the doors into the cool night. The garden beyond was dark, lit only by a scattering of lanterns hung along the stone path. She walked until the noise of the ballroom faded into a distant hum, and only then did she allow herself to breathe. "He is a fool," a voice said behind her. Margaret turned quickly, startled. The Duke stood a few paces away, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable in the lantern light. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a hurried curtsy, "I did not mean to occupy this corner of the garden. I will return inside." "You need not," he said. "I only meant that Captain Coldwell is a fool. Any man who says such a thing to a woman in a room full of witnesses has revealed more about his own character than about yours." Margaret did not know how to answer. No one had ever spoken to her so directly, especially not a man of his rank. She studied him for a moment, trying to determine whether he mocked her or meant what he said. "You are kind to say so," she said carefully, "but I suspect most of the room believes he spoke the truth." "Most of the room," the Duke said, "was not looking at you when he said it." "I was." Something in his tone made her look up. There was no cruelty in his face, no trace of the amusement she had seen in others. He looked at her the way he might examine a ledger that did not balance, searching for the error that everyone else had overlooked. "You are Margaret Ashford," he said. It was not a question. "I am, Your Grace. Your father managed the eastern boundary dispute with my late uncle some years ago. I have read his correspondence. He was a careful man, thorough." Margaret blinked, surprised. Few people spoke of her father with such regard, and fewer still knew the details of his work. "You have read his letters?" "I inherited a great many papers when I took the title. Most of them are useless. His were not." The Duke paused. "I understand he passed 2 years ago." "He did," Margaret said, her voice quieter now. "And since then, I imagine you have managed a great deal in his place." It was such an unusual thing to say, so different from the empty compliments men usually offered her, that Margaret found herself answering honestly. "Someone must. My mother does not concern herself with accounts, and Louisa has never balanced a ledger in her life." The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. It was not proper to speak so plainly of her family's failings, especially not to a duke she had only just met. But instead of looking scandalized, Edmund Whitlock's mouth curved, just slightly, into something that was not quite a smile but was close to one. "Then you are more capable than most of the gentlemen inside that ballroom," he said. "They could not tell you the difference between a ledger and a love letter." Margaret felt a small, unfamiliar warmth rise in her chest, something quite different from the humiliation of moments before. She was not used to being told she was capable. She was used to being told she was plain, practical, unremarkable next to her sister's beauty. "You flatter me, Your Grace." "I do not flatter," he said simply. "I have little patience for it. If I say a thing, I mean it." From inside the ballroom, the music shifted, and Margaret could hear her mother's voice calling for her, sharp and irritated, likely wondering why her elder daughter had wandered off during such an important evening for Louisa. "I should return," Margaret said. "My mother will worry." The Duke inclined his head. "Of course. But Miss Ashford, before you go, I wonder if I might call upon your family this week. There is a matter concerning the boundary land your father once managed. It requires someone who understands the old agreements, and I suspect that person is no longer your father, but you." Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You wish to speak with me about the land dispute?" "I do. My mother will assume you have come to see Louisa." "Your mother may assume what she likes," the Duke said. "I know precisely who I wish to see." He bowed, briefly, and turned back toward the ballroom, leaving Margaret standing alone in the lantern light, her heart beating in a strange new rhythm. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at her and seen something worth noticing. She glanced back toward the golden windows of the ballroom, where Louisa still danced in Henry Coldwell's arms, unaware that anything of consequence had happened at all. Margaret smoothed her skirts, lifted her chin once more, and walked back inside, no longer certain that the worst moment of her evening had been the one that mattered most. Behind her, in the dark garden, the lantern light flickered once and steadied, as though marking the quiet beginning of something neither of them yet understood. Inside, the heat of the ballroom struck her at once, thick with candle smoke and the perfume of 100 overdressed guests. Her mother found her within moments, weaving through the crowd with the particular urgency she reserved for matters of social importance. "There you are," Mrs. Ashford said, seizing Margaret's arm with more force than necessary. "Where have you been hiding? Did you see your sister? Captain Coldwell has hardly left her side all evening." "I saw," Margaret said quietly. Her mother did not seem to notice the flatness in her daughter's voice, too occupied with scanning the room for anyone of importance who might be watching Louisa's triumph. "He is a captain, Margaret, with connections in the north. If he offers for her, it will be the making of this family. Do try to look pleased for your sister." Margaret said nothing. There was little point in explaining what had happened only minutes before, the cruel words spoken in front of half the county. The humiliation she had swallowed whole so that no one would see it reach her eyes. Her mother would only say that Margaret had misunderstood, or worse, that she had brought it upon herself by expecting too much. "Come, stand near the refreshment table," her mother instructed, already pulling her forward. "The Baroness Fenwick is there, and I should like her to see that both my daughters are present and accounted for, even if only one of them is likely to marry well this season." The words landed exactly as they were meant to, a small, practiced cruelty that her mother had delivered so many times before that she no longer seemed to notice their sting. Margaret had long since learned not to react. She allowed herself to be steered across the room, nodding politely to acquaintances, answering questions about the weather and the music with practiced, hollow pleasantness. It was only when she caught sight of Louisa, laughing brightly at something Henry had said, that the earlier humiliation returned in full force. She wondered if Louisa even remembered what Henry had said in that moment, or if she had been too delighted by his attention to notice the cruelty behind it. Likely the latter. Louisa had never been unkind on purpose. She was simply unaware, the way a bright flame is unaware of the moths it draws too close. Margaret excused herself as soon as she could manage it, claiming a headache that was not entirely a lie, and found a quiet chair near the edge of the room where she might watch the evening unfold without being asked to participate in it. From there she could see the Duke of Yardworth once more, standing near a group of older gentlemen, nodding occasionally, saying little. He did not look toward her again, not obviously, but once, just once, she caught the briefest turn of his head in her direction, before he returned his attention to the conversation beside him. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not call upon plain, practical daughters over beautiful ones, whatever kind words they offered in a dark garden. Whatever he had said about wishing to speak with her, about a boundary dispute and old agreements, was likely nothing more than politeness extended to soften the blow of what she had endured that evening. Men of his rank did not concern themselves with women like her. And yet, as the carriage rattled home through the cold night, her mother chattering endlessly about Louisa's prospects, Margaret found herself returning again and again to the memory of his voice in the darkness. "He is a fool. Any man who says such a thing has revealed more about his own character than about yours." No one had ever defended her so plainly before. No one had ever looked at her, in the midst of her worst humiliation, and seen something worth speaking to. She did not know what to make of it. She only knew that for the first time in a very long while, she found herself waiting, with something close to hope, to see whether Edmund Whitlock would keep his word. The carriage jolted over a rut in the road, and her mother's voice faded into the background as Margaret turned to watch the dark fields pass beyond the window, her reflection faint and pale in the glass, and behind it, unbidden, the memory of a man who had called her capable when the rest of the world called her nothing at all. 3 days after the ball, a carriage bearing the crest of Yardworth arrived at the Ashford house, and the entire household fell into a state of barely controlled chaos. Mrs. Ashford was the first to see it from the front window, and her scream of delight brought the housemaid running from the kitchen, certain something terrible had happened. "It is the Duke," Mrs. Ashford cried, clutching at the curtain. "The Duke of Yardworth is here. Louisa, come quickly, fix your hair. He must have heard of you from someone at the ball." Margaret, seated at the small writing desk in the corner of the drawing room where she had been reviewing the household accounts, felt her stomach tighten. She had told no one of the conversation in the garden, not wishing to invite questions she could not answer, nor to raise hopes that would surely be disappointed. Now, watching her mother rush about the room in a frenzy of pillow straightening and mirror checking, she wondered if she should have said something after all. "Perhaps he comes on a matter of business," Margaret offered quietly, though no one seemed to hear her over the commotion. Louisa appeared moments later, her hair already rearranged, a fresh ribbon tied at her waist. She looked radiant, as she always did, and utterly unconcerned, as though dukes calling at country houses were an ordinary occurrence in her life. In truth, it very well might become one, if Mrs. Ashford had her way. The butler announced the Duke's arrival, and Edmund Whitlock stepped into the drawing room, his presence somehow making the modest space feel smaller and more formal than it had ever seemed before. He bowed to Mrs. Ashford, who curtsied so deeply that Margaret feared she might not rise again without assistance, and then his gaze moved past Louisa entirely, to settle on Margaret, still seated at the writing desk with ink-stained fingers. "Miss Ashford," he said, "I hope I have not called at an inconvenient hour." Mrs. Ashford's smile faltered, just slightly, confusion flickering across her face as she realized the greeting had been directed at her elder daughter rather than her younger one. "Your Grace, please, sit. May I offer you tea?" Louisa was just saying how much she enjoyed the ball on Thursday. "That is kind," the Duke said, without looking at Louisa, "but I have come on a matter concerning your late husband's work, and I believe Miss Margaret Ashford is the only person who might assist me with it." The room fell silent. Mrs. Ashford's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, clearly uncertain how to respond to a Duke who had arrived expressly to speak with the daughter she considered least likely to secure his attention. "Of course," she managed finally. "Margaret, do sit with His Grace. I shall bring the tea myself." Margaret rose from the writing desk, smoothing her plain morning dress, acutely aware of how it compared to Louisa's carefully arranged appearance. She gestured toward the small settee near the window, and the Duke seated himself with the same quiet composure he had shown in the garden, as though the awkwardness filling the room around him did not touch him at all. Louisa lingered near the door for a moment, clearly unsure whether to stay or go, before excusing herself with a confused little laugh and disappearing toward the hall. Margaret felt a flicker of sympathy for her sister, who had never once had to work for anyone's attention and did not know what to do when it was withheld. "I apologize if my visit has caused disorder," the Duke said once they were alone. "Save for the housemaid setting out the tea tray, I did not consider that your mother might expect a different purpose behind it." "You could hardly have expected otherwise," Margaret said. "Dukes do not typically call to discuss boundary agreements with the daughter who keeps the household ledgers." "Then dukes are foolish," he said, "for the daughter who keeps the ledgers is precisely the one worth calling upon." Margaret felt her cheeks warm, though she tried to keep her expression composed. She poured the tea herself once the housemaid withdrew, grateful for the small task that gave her hands something to do besides betray her nervousness. "You mentioned a boundary dispute," she said, steering the conversation toward safer ground. "The eastern fields, I believe you said." "Yes." The Duke reached into the leather case he had brought with him and withdrew a folded set of papers, spreading them carefully across the small table between them. "My uncle and your father corresponded for nearly 2 years regarding the exact line dividing our properties. The old maps disagree with the newer survey, and the tenants on both sides have begun to argue over which fields belong to whom. I need someone who understands the original agreement, and your father's letters suggest he understood it better than anyone." Margaret leaned forward, studying the papers with genuine interest. She had spent countless evenings after her father's death poring over his old correspondence, trying to understand the affairs he had left behind. and the boundary dispute was one she remembered clearly. My father believed the confusion began when the old surveyor mismarked the stream's course after the flood some 15 years ago, she said, tracing a line on the map with her finger. He wrote to your uncle suggesting they commission a new survey together, splitting the cost, but I do not believe it was ever completed before your uncle's passing. The Duke studied her with an expression she could not quite interpret, something between surprise and satisfaction. You know all this from memory? I read his letters many times, Margaret said. There was little else to occupy my evenings after he died. My mother does not concern herself with such matters, and Louisa has never had reason to. Then you have done, alone, what should have been the work of solicitors and surveyors, the Duke said. That is no small thing, Miss Ashford. They spent the better part of an hour bent over the maps together, Margaret pointing out details from her father's letters that clarified points of confusion, the Duke asking careful, precise questions that showed he was listening not out of politeness but out of genuine interest in solving the problem correctly. It was, Margaret realized partway through the conversation, the first time in years that anyone had asked for her opinion on a matter of real substance and waited, patiently, to hear her full answer. I would like to commission the new survey your father suggested, the Duke said eventually, gathering the papers back into his case. But I will need someone to review the tenant records on your side of the boundary, to ensure the new lines account for existing agreements. Would you be willing to assist with that work? Margaret hesitated. It was an unusual request, certainly, for a woman to be asked to review estate business alongside a duke, and she knew her mother would object the moment she learned of it. But the prospect of useful work, work that mattered, work that no one could dismiss as foolish or unnecessary, stirred something in her she had not felt in a very long time. I would be glad to help, she said. Good. The Duke rose and Margaret rose with him, walking him toward the drawing-room door. I will send word once the surveyor has set a date. In the meantime, Miss Ashford, I hope you will forgive me if I say that our conversation this afternoon was considerably more useful than most I have at social gatherings. You flatter me again, Your Grace. I told you before. I do not flatter. He paused at the door, studying her for a moment longer than politeness strictly required. Good afternoon, Miss Ashford. He bowed and departed, leaving Margaret standing alone in the entryway, her heart beating with a strange, unfamiliar lightness. She had barely turned back toward the drawing room when her mother appeared, practically vibrating with confusion and irritation.
What on earth did he want with you?
Mrs. Ashford demanded. A boundary dispute? Margaret, you cannot seriously believe a duke rides across the county to discuss fences and streams. There must be some other reason. I assure you, Mother, there was nothing more to it than business, Margaret said. Though even as she spoke the words, she found herself uncertain whether she entirely believed them. Well, it is a peculiar sort of business, her mother sniffed, already moving toward the window to watch the ducal carriage disappear down the lane. I do hope he intends to invite Louisa to something soon. It would be such a waste for a man of his position to spend his afternoons discussing maps instead of matrimony. Margaret said nothing, returning instead to the writing desk where the household accounts still waited, half finished. But her mind remained on the boundary maps, on the careful, considering way the Duke had listened to her, and on the strange, quiet hope that had begun to take root somewhere beneath her ribs, however much she tried to reason it away. That evening, alone in her room, Margaret took out her father's old letters once more, not out of necessity this time, but because she found herself wanting to understand every detail of the dispute before the surveyor arrived. She wanted, she realized with some surprise, to prove that the Duke's confidence in her had not been misplaced. It had been a very long time since she had wanted to prove anything to anyone at all. Louisa found her there an hour later, curled in the window seat with papers spread across her lap, a single candle burning low beside her. Her sister leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, an expression on her face that Margaret rarely saw there, something closer to genuine curiosity than the usual careless cheerfulness. You have been up here for ages, Louisa said. Mother is still talking about the Duke downstairs. She has decided he must have some hidden reason for calling on you instead of me. There is no hidden reason, Margaret said, not looking up from the letter in her hands. He needed help with an old dispute over land. That is all. That is all, Louisa repeated, walking further into the room and settling herself on the edge of the bed. Margaret, dukes do not spend an hour discussing streams and fences with young women unless they wish to. He could have sent a solicitor. He could have written a letter. Instead, he came himself, and he asked for you by name in front of Mother and me both. Margaret set the letter down, unsettled by how closely her sister's words echoed the thoughts she had been trying to push away all evening. You make it sound as though it means something it does not. Perhaps, Louisa said, though her tone suggested she did not believe it. Or perhaps you are so unused to anyone paying you proper attention that you cannot recognize it when it happens. She said this without cruelty, almost gently, and Margaret found she did not know how to respond to such unexpected honesty from a sister she had always assumed too self-absorbed to notice anything beyond her own reflection. I am not looking for attention, Margaret said finally. I only wish to be useful. There is little enough for me to do in this house besides accounts and correspondence. You could have more than that, if you allowed yourself to want it. Louisa rose again, smoothing her skirts, pausing at the door. I know Mother favors me. I have always known it. But I am not blind, Margaret. I saw how the Duke looked at you tonight. Henry Coldwell never looked at me that way, not once, not even when he was saying all those pretty things at the ball. She left before Margaret could think of a reply, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Margaret alone once more with her candle and her father's letters, and a strange new weight in her chest that she could not quite name. She had spent so many years believing herself invisible beside her sister, that she scarcely knew what to do with the suggestion that someone, anyone, might see her differently. She thought of the Duke's steady gaze across the ballroom, of his blunt refusal to offer empty flattery, of the careful way he had listened to every word she said about the boundary dispute, as though her opinion carried real weight. It was such a small thing, being listened to, and yet she could not remember the last time it had happened to her in quite that way. Sleep did not come easily that night. Margaret lay awake long after the candle had burned down to nothing, turning the day's events over in her mind, trying to convince herself that she was imagining significance where there was none, that a Duke's request for practical assistance meant nothing more than exactly what it appeared to be. But beneath that careful reasoning, a smaller, quieter voice kept insisting otherwise, and she found she did not have the will to silence it entirely. The following morning, a note arrived from Yardworth Hall, brief and businesslike, informing her that the surveyor would begin his work within the week, and requesting that Margaret prepare whatever records of the tenant agreements she could gather in the meantime. She read it twice, searching for some hidden warmth beneath the formal language, and found none, and yet the plainness of it pleased her more than any flowery compliment could have. She spent the following days buried in her father's papers with a diligence she had not felt in years, cross-referencing old agreements, noting discrepancies, preparing careful summaries that she hoped would prove useful when the surveyor's work began. Her mother continued to grumble about the strangeness of it all, certain that some proper courtship was being neglected in favor of tedious business, but Margaret found she cared less and less what her mother thought of the arrangement. For the first time since her father's death, she had a purpose that belonged entirely to her, one that no one could take away or dismiss as unimportant, and whatever came of her acquaintance with the Duke of Yardworth, she intended to prove herself equal to the task he had trusted her with. The surveyor arrived on a cold, bright morning, a thin, precise man named Walter Finch who spoke almost entirely in measurements and angles. Margaret met him at the eastern boundary alongside the Duke, her arms full of her father's old records, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp autumn air. Miss Ashford has prepared summaries of every tenant agreement touching this stretch of land, the Duke told the surveyor, gesturing toward the papers she carried. I trust her account of the old boundary more than the maps in my uncle's files. Finch raised an eyebrow but said nothing beyond a polite greeting, clearly unaccustomed to a young woman being included so directly in matters of estate business. Margaret held her ground, opening the first of her summaries and beginning to explain, in clear and careful terms, exactly where her father believed the original streambed had run before the flood altered its course. It took the better part of the morning to walk the disputed land, comparing Margaret's notes against the surveyor's instruments, marking stakes at intervals along what appeared to be the true original boundary. The Duke walked beside her for much of it, saying little, but watching closely as she corrected Finch on 2 separate occasions where his readings did not match the tenant agreements she had gathered. You have a sharper eye for this than half the men I employ, the Duke said quietly, during a moment when the surveyor had moved ahead to check a marker. I have simply read the same papers many times, Margaret said. There is no great skill in it. There is considerable skill in reading carefully enough to catch what others miss, he replied. Finch has surveyed a dozen estates this year alone, and yet you found his error within the hour. Margaret felt the familiar warmth rise in her cheeks again, the one she had begun to associate with his particular way of speaking, direct and unadorned, offering praise the way one might state a simple fact rather than a compliment meant to charm. She was beginning to understand that this was simply how Edmund Whitlock spoke to everyone, without artifice, and she found she trusted his words all the more for it. By midday, The boundary had been marked to everyone's satisfaction, and Finch departed to begin drafting the formal survey, leaving Margaret and the Duke to walk back toward the carriages alone. The autumn light slanted low across the fields, gilding the dry grass gold, and for a while neither of them spoke, content in a silence that felt, to Margaret's surprise, entirely comfortable. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she said eventually. "You may. Why did you truly seek me out that night at the ball? You could have written to my mother or approached the matter through your solicitor entirely, without ever speaking to me directly." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Margaret wondered if she had overstepped. When he finally answered, his voice had lost some of its usual composure, softened by something she could not quite name. "I watched Captain Coldwell humiliate you in front of 200 people," he said. "And I watched you straighten your shoulders and walk away without a single tear, without a single word of protest, as though you had decided, in that moment, that his opinion of you did not deserve the satisfaction of your grief. I have known very few people, man or woman, capable of that kind of composure. I wish to know more of the woman who possessed it." Margaret stopped walking, startled by the honesty of his answer. She had expected some practical explanation, something about her father's expertise or her family's connections, not this quiet, unguarded admission that he had simply been watching her, and had liked what he saw. "I nearly did cry," she admitted. "I only waited until I reached the garden. And even then, you did not," he said. "I was there, if you recall. You spoke to me with perfect steadiness, though I imagine your heart was still breaking." "It was," Margaret said softly, "though it feels foolish to admit it now." "It is not foolish. It would be strange indeed if such cruelty did not wound you." He resumed walking, and she fell into step beside him. "I only meant to say that composure in the face of cruelty is a rarer quality than beauty or charm, though it is valued far less by the sort of people who fill ballrooms." They walked the rest of the way to the carriages mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than before, charged now with everything that had been said, and everything that remained unspoken between them. When they reached the drive, the Duke helped her into her family's small carriage himself, rather than leaving the task to a footman, his hand steady beneath her own for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I will send word once Finch has completed the formal survey," he said. "Though I confess I would welcome the chance to consult you again, whether or not the boundary requires it." Margaret felt her breath catch slightly at the implication behind his words, careful as they were. "I would welcome that as well, Your Grace." He bowed, and the carriage pulled away, leaving Margaret to watch him grow smaller through the small rear window, standing alone at the edge of the disputed field he had just spent the morning resolving alongside her. The weeks that followed brought a quiet rhythm to Margaret's days that she had not known since before her father's death. The Duke called at the house twice more, ostensibly to review Finch's progress on the survey, though their conversations wandered further from boundary lines each time, touching on books they had both read, on her father's other business dealings, on the running of an estate, and the particular burdens that came with responsibility neither of them had ever been permitted to set aside. Meanwhile, Louisa's courtship with Henry Coldwell had become the subject of constant conversation throughout the county. He called on her nearly every day, bringing flowers and small gifts, escorting her to every gathering with the kind of public devotion that left little doubt as to his intentions. Mrs. Ashford spoke of little else, already planning the wedding in her mind, already imagining the connections such a marriage might bring to the family's standing. Margaret found herself, more often than she wished to admit, comparing the two courtships taking place within her own household. Henry's attentions to Louisa were loud, effusive, performed as much for the benefit of onlookers as for Louisa herself. The Duke's attentions to Margaret, if they could even be called that, were quiet, private, built on genuine interest rather than display. She told herself this meant nothing, that a duke's practical visits regarding land disputes could not be compared to an open courtship, and yet she found the comparison difficult to set aside entirely. It was at a small dinner party hosted by the Fenwick family, some 3 weeks after the boundary survey began, that Margaret first heard the whispers directly. She had stepped away from the drawing room to find a quiet corner, still unused to the attention that had begun following her since the Duke's visits became known throughout the county, when she overheard two women speaking near the hall. "They say he calls on her nearly every week," one voice said, low but not quiet enough. "The elder Ashford girl, not the pretty one. I cannot imagine what he sees in her." "Business, surely," the other replied. "A duke would never seriously consider the plain sister when the beautiful one is available and clearly willing." Margaret felt her cheeks burn, the old familiar shame rising in her chest, the same shame she had felt at the ball, when Henry's cruel words had echoed across the room. She had thought herself past caring what such women said of her, but the sting proved sharper than she expected. perhaps because some small, hopeful part of her had begun to believe that the Duke's attention meant something beyond mere convenience. She retreated further down the hall, intending to find a quiet room where she might compose herself, and nearly collided with the Duke himself, who had apparently stepped out for the same reason, seeking a moment's escape from the crowded drawing room. "Miss Ashford," he said, immediately noting the color in her cheeks, "has something distressed you?" "It is nothing, Your Grace," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed her. "It is clearly something." His expression sharpened, concern replacing his usual composure. "Tell me." Margaret hesitated, unwilling to repeat the cruel words she had overheard, unwilling to appear as though she sought his reassurance or his defense. But something in his steady gaze made honesty easier than she expected. "There is talk," she admitted finally, "about your visits. Some believe there can be no genuine purpose behind them, beyond business. Given that Louisa is—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Given that Louisa is considered the more beautiful sister," the Duke finished for her, his voice edged with something close to anger. "And therefore the more suitable object of my attention. Something of that nature, yes." The Duke was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight, and Margaret wondered if she had erred in telling him at all. But when he spoke again, his voice had softened, though the intensity behind it remained. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who value beauty and charm above every other quality a person might possess," he said. "My own family expected me to marry for exactly those reasons, years ago, before circumstances changed the course of my life entirely. I have no patience left for such shallow judgments, Miss Ashford, and I would ask that you pay them no mind either, however difficult that may be." "You speak as though you have experience with such judgments yourself," Margaret said carefully, sensing an opening into the guarded parts of his past she had begun to wonder about. "I do," he said simply, offering nothing further, though his expression suggested there was considerably more beneath the surface of that single word than he was yet willing to share. "But that is a conversation for another day, I think. Tonight, I would rather you simply understood that whatever gossip circulates through drawing rooms and hallways means nothing to me. I call on you because I value your mind and your company, Miss Ashford, not out of any obligation, and certainly not as some poor substitute for your sister." The directness of his words left Margaret momentarily speechless, standing in the quiet hallway with her heart beating unsteadily against her ribs. She had spent so many years believing herself invisible beside Louisa, that she scarcely knew how to accept being chosen so plainly, so deliberately, by anyone at all. "Thank you," she managed finally, "for saying so." "I have told you before," he said, the faintest hint of warmth returning to his expression. "I do not flatter, Miss Ashford. I only ever say what I mean." They returned to the drawing room separately, some minutes apart, to avoid drawing further attention, but Margaret carried his words with her for the rest of the evening, and long after, turning them over in her mind like a treasure she did not yet know how to hold. When she re-entered the drawing room, Louisa caught her eye from across the space, where she sat beside Henry Coldwell, laughing at something one of the other guests had said. For a brief moment, Margaret thought she saw something flicker across her sister's face, not jealousy exactly, but a kind of searching curiosity, as though Louisa too had begun to notice the shift taking place within their small family, the quiet reversal of attention that no one had expected and few seemed entirely comfortable with. Mrs. Ashford, seated near the fire with the other mothers of the parish, waved Margaret over the moment she noticed her return. "Where have you been? You missed Mrs. Fenwick's account of the assembly rooms in Bath. Come, sit. You look flushed. Are you unwell?" "I am quite well, Mother," Margaret said, taking the offered seat, grateful that her mother's attention remained fixed on matters of far less consequence than the conversation she had just left in the hallway. The evening continued much as such evenings always did, with cards and conversation and the slow, comfortable unwinding of a country gathering. But Margaret found her attention repeatedly drawn back to the Duke, seated across the room in quiet conversation with Mr. Fenwick, his expression composed once more, betraying nothing of the intensity she had witnessed only minutes before. She wondered how many people in that room truly knew him, beyond the cold, dutiful reputation that preceded him everywhere he went. She suspected the answer was very few, and found herself unexpectedly proud to be counted, however briefly, among them. The following days brought further whispers, as such things always did in a county with little else to occupy its attention. Margaret bore them as best she could, holding tight to the Duke's words whenever the old shame threatened to resurface, reminding herself that his opinion mattered a great deal more to her than the idle judgments of women who had never spared her a second glance until his visits began. Louisa, to Margaret's surprise, proved unexpectedly protective in the weeks that followed. When one of the younger Fenwick daughters made a pointed remark at a card party about dukes and their peculiar business arrangements, Louisa cut the conversation short with a sharpness that startled everyone present, including Margaret herself. My sister has done more to manage this family's affairs since our father's passing than anyone in this room could hope to accomplish, Louisa said, her voice carrying an edge Margaret had rarely heard from her before. If the Duke of Yardworth values her mind enough to seek her counsel, I hardly think that reflects poorly on her. The room fell briefly silent, and Margaret felt an unfamiliar rush of gratitude toward the sister she had spent so many years believing, incapable of noticing anyone's struggles but her own. Perhaps, she thought, she had misjudged Louisa as thoroughly as the county had misjudged her, each of them reduced to a single quality, beauty on one side and plainness on the other, when both of them were considerably more complicated than that. That evening, walking home from the card party, Louisa linked her arm through Margaret's, an unusual gesture of closeness between the two sisters, who had grown apart in the years since their father's death, each retreating into her own role within the family, Louisa into charm and beauty, Margaret into duty and quiet competence. I meant what I said, Louisa told her, as they walked beneath the cold autumn stars. I have watched you carry this family for 2 years now, Margaret, while I did little more than attend parties and hope for a good match. I never properly thanked you for it. You need not thank me, Margaret said, though the words touched her more than she expected. It was simply what needed to be done. That is precisely the trouble, Louisa said. You have always done what needed to be done, without complaint, without expecting anything in return, while I took the easier path and never once considered what it cost you. She paused, squeezing Margaret's arm gently. I am glad the Duke sees your worth. I only wish I had seen it sooner myself. Margaret found she had no ready answer for such unexpected honesty, and the two sisters walked the rest of the way home in a companionable silence that felt, for the first time in years, like something closer to genuine friendship than mere obligation. Do you think he means to court you properly? Louisa asked, after a while, her voice careful, curious rather than teasing. Margaret considered the question seriously before answering. I do not know. He has never spoken of courtship. Only of the survey, and of conversation, and of valuing my company. I do not wish to imagine more than what is truly there. And yet you hope for it, Louisa said. It was not a question. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I hope for it more than I should admit, even to myself. Then I hope for it too, Louisa said simply, and there was nothing but sincerity in her voice, no trace of the careless self-absorption Margaret had grown so used to expecting from her. You deserve to be chosen properly, Margaret, not settled for, not overlooked in favor of someone brighter or louder. I think the Duke understands that already, better than most men would. They reached the house at last, its windows glowing faintly with candlelight against the dark fields beyond, and as they climbed the front steps together, Margaret found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely hopeful about what the future might hold. Whatever gossip continued to circulate through the county's drawing rooms, whatever complications lay ahead in her uncertain understanding with the Duke of Yardworth, she found herself grateful, at least, that she no longer faced any of it entirely alone. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the fields around Yardworth Hall with a thin layer of frost that lingered well into the afternoon. Margaret had come to the estate at the Duke's invitation, ostensibly to review Finch's completed survey before it was submitted to the county records office, though both of them had long since stopped pretending their meetings were purely a matter of business. She found him in the library, a vast, cold room lined floor to ceiling with books that looked as though few of them had been opened in years. He stood near the window, a letter in his hand, his expression distant in a way she had not seen before. Your Grace, she said, hesitating in the doorway. I did not mean to intrude. You are not intruding. He set the letter down on a side table, though not before Margaret noticed the seal, broken and unfamiliar, and the tightness around his eyes that suggested whatever news it carried had not been welcome. Please, come in. I have the survey ready for your review. They worked through the papers together for the better part of an hour, Margaret pointing out a small discrepancy in the tenant boundary near the northern field, the Duke making a note to have Finch correct it before submission. But his attention seemed divided that afternoon, his usual precision replaced by something quieter, more distracted, and Margaret found herself watching him more than the papers spread across the table. Is something troubling you, Your Grace? She asked finally, when he had read the same line of the survey twice without seeming to register it. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she wondered if he would deflect the question entirely, as he had once before in the hallway of the Fenwick house. But this time, he set the papers aside and looked at her directly, something unguarded in his expression that she had not seen before. "The letter you noticed on the table," he said. "It came from a family I once knew well. They informed me that their daughter, Charlotte, is to be married next spring, to a viscount with considerably more charm than fortune." Margaret said nothing, sensing there was more to the story than the simple fact he had offered, and waited. "I was engaged to her once," he continued, his voice carefully even, though Margaret could hear the effort behind that evenness. 6 years ago, before I inherited the title. Her family arranged it when we were both very young, and I confess I believed myself in love with her, in the way young men often believe themselves in love with the first woman who shows them any real kindness. "What happened?" Margaret asked gently. "My brother died," the Duke said simply. "Suddenly, of a fever that no physician could explain or prevent, I became heir to a title I had never expected to hold, and Charlotte's family, who had once been perfectly content with a younger son of modest prospects, suddenly found themselves reconsidering the match entirely." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "Not because they objected to my becoming a duke, you understand, but because they feared the responsibility would change me into someone Charlotte could not manage. Her mother said as much, quite plainly, when she broke the engagement." "That was cruel," Margaret said quietly. "Perhaps, though I have come to believe she was not entirely wrong." He turned back toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back in the same posture Margaret remembered from the garden, that first night at the ball. "The title did change me. It made me colder, more exacting, less patient with the small performances and pleasantries that fill every ballroom and drawing room in the county. I stopped trying to charm anyone a long time ago, Miss Ashford, because I discovered that charm was never the thing that mattered most, and I grew tired of pretending otherwise." Margaret rose from her chair and crossed to stand beside him at the window, watching the frost-covered fields stretch out toward the horizon. "I do not think you cold, Your Grace. I think you are simply honest, in a world that has grown far too comfortable with pretty lies." He turned to look at her then, something shifting in his expression, the careful composure cracking just slightly, to reveal the uncertainty beneath it. "You are one of the few people who has ever said so. Most find my honesty difficult to forgive." "Then most people are foolish," Margaret said, echoing the words he had once spoken to her, in the garden, about Henry Coldwell. "I would rather have your honesty than 100 empty compliments from men who mean nothing they say." Something in his expression softened further, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them charged with everything that remained unsaid. Margaret was acutely aware of how close they stood, of the faint warmth radiating from the fire behind them, of the particular quality of his attention when it settled on her, focused and complete, as though nothing else in the room existed. "When Charlotte's engagement ended," he said finally, "I told myself I would never again allow anyone close enough to matter that much. It seemed safer, simpler, to keep myself at a distance, to let the title define me entirely, rather than risk being disappointed again." He paused. "I have found that resolution considerably more difficult to maintain since the night of the Fenwick ball." Margaret's breath caught slightly at the implication behind his words, carefully chosen as they were. "Your Grace." "Edmund," he said quietly. "I would like you to call me Edmund, at least when we are alone. I find I am tired of titles, Margaret, when it comes to you." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice sent an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. "Edmund," she repeated softly, testing the shape of it. "I do not know precisely what this is between us," he admitted, his usual bluntness returning, though gentler now than she had ever heard it. "I only know that I look forward to your visits more than I have looked forward to anything in a very long time, and that the thought of you returning to your mother's house, marrying some ordinary gentleman who fails entirely to appreciate your mind, troubles me a great deal more than it reasonably should." Margaret felt her heart racing, uncertain how to answer such an unexpected, unguarded admission. "I have no prospects of ordinary gentlemen, Edmund. My mother has made it quite clear that Louisa is the daughter expected to marry well." "Your mother is mistaken," he said. "If she believes beauty alone determines a woman's worth, I have known considerably more beautiful women than you, Margaret, and not one of them has ever made me want to abandon a lifetime of careful distance the way you have, in the space of a few short months." The fire crackled behind them, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the hour, but Margaret barely noticed either sound, too absorbed in the steady, unflinching honesty of his gaze. She understood, standing there in the cold library with the frost-covered fields stretching beyond the window, that whatever remained unspoken between them would not stay unspoken for very much longer. "I should return home before my mother begins to worry," she said finally, though she made no immediate move toward the door. Of course. He did not step back, and neither did she. though I confess I am reluctant to let this conversation end here. It need not end entirely, Margaret said. Only pause, until we might continue it properly. He smiled then, a real smile, unguarded and warm, transforming his usually severe features into something younger, something less burdened by the weight of duty and title. Properly, he agreed. Yes, I think that would be wise. He walked her to the carriage himself, as he always did, but this time, as he handed her up into the seat, his hand lingered around hers a moment longer than strict propriety allowed, and neither of them made any move to pull away, until the coachman cleared his throat, gently reminding them both of the world beyond the quiet library they had just left behind. As the carriage pulled away from Yardworth Hall, Margaret pressed her hand against the cold window glass, watching Edmund's figure grow smaller against the great gray house behind him, and felt, for the first time since her father's death, that the future held something worth genuinely hoping for. The ride home passed in a blur of frosted hedgerows and bare trees, Margaret's thoughts too full of the afternoon's conversation to notice much of the passing countryside. She kept returning to the moment he had asked her to use his given name, to the raw honesty in his voice when he spoke of Charlotte, of his brother's death, of the careful distance he had built around himself in the years since. She understood now why the county considered him cold, why so many mothers had given up hope of matching their daughters to him despite his title and fortune. He had simply stopped offering anyone the version of himself that might be easily liked, choosing instead to remain exactly, unapologetically who he was, whether or not it won him any favor. It was that same unflinching honesty, she realized, that had drawn her to him from the very first night in the garden. He had never once told her what she wished to hear. He had told her, instead, exactly what he believed to be true, even when the truth was uncomfortable, even when it revealed more of himself than most men would ever willingly share. Louisa met her at the door when the carriage arrived, her expression eager despite the late hour. "You were gone for hours. Mother has been asking after you all afternoon. What happened?" Margaret hesitated, uncertain how much to share, even with a sister who had proven herself unexpectedly kind in recent weeks. "We reviewed the survey. It is nearly ready for submission." "That is not what I asked," Louisa said, following her into the front hall, taking her cloak with careful attention despite the servant hovering nearby to do the same task. "You look different, Margaret. Something happened beyond boundary lines and old maps." Margaret allowed herself a small, private smile, unable to entirely suppress the warmth still lingering from the afternoon's conversation. "He told me about his past, about an engagement that ended badly, years ago, before he inherited the title. I do not think he has spoken of it to many people." "And he chose to tell you," Louisa said, her expression softening with understanding. "That is no small thing, Margaret, for a man like him. Everyone in the county speaks of how guarded he is, how little anyone truly knows him beyond his title and his fortune." "He asked me to call him Edmund," Margaret admitted quietly, "when we are alone." Louisa's eyes widened, and for a moment, Margaret feared she might announce the news to their mother immediately, filling the house with the same frenzied excitement that had accompanied the Duke's very first visit. But instead, Louisa simply reached out and squeezed her sister's hand, her expression gentle in a way that felt entirely new between them. "I am glad," she said simply. "Truly, Margaret, whatever comes of this, I am glad someone has finally seen what I have always known was there, even when I did not know how to say it properly myself." They climbed the stairs together, and Margaret retired to her room, though sleep proved elusive once again, her mind too full of frost-covered fields and firelit libraries, and the particular warmth in Edmund's eyes when he had spoken her name for the very first time, stripped of every formal title, offered to her plainly, honestly, exactly as he had promised he always would. She lay awake long into the night, turning the afternoon's conversation over in her mind, wondering what it meant that a man so guarded, so wounded by past disappointment, had chosen to open himself to her so completely. She did not yet know where this quiet, careful courtship, if it could even be called that, might lead. But she found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was no longer afraid to hope for something more than mere survival, more than duty, more than the quiet, dutiful life she had resigned herself to living in the years since her father's death. Whatever Edmund Whitlock, Duke of Yardworth, truly wanted from her, Margaret understood now that it was not pity, and it was not mere convenience. It was something far rarer, something she had never expected to find, least of all from a man the entire county considered too cold and too guarded to ever truly want anyone at all. Downstairs, long after the household had settled into sleep, Mrs. Ashford sat alone by the dying fire, turning over the day's events with a very different kind of interest than her daughters upstairs. She had heard enough, through the half-open door and the servants' quiet gossip, to understand that something significant had shifted between Margaret and the Duke, something considerably beyond boundary surveys and old family papers. She did not yet know what to make of it, torn between her long-held assumption that Louisa would be the daughter to marry well, and the undeniable evidence that the Duke of Yardworth had eyes for no one but her elder daughter at all. It was, she decided finally, a matter that required careful thought, and perhaps, however reluctantly, a reconsideration of assumptions she had carried for a very long time. The invitation to the Coldwell family's winter gathering arrived a fortnight later, addressed to the entire Ashford household, and Mrs. Ashford accepted with the kind of breathless enthusiasm she reserved for any occasion likely to advance Louisa's prospects. Margaret suspected, from the careful way her mother avoided mentioning it, that Henry's family had specifically requested the presence of both daughters, curious perhaps about the rumors that had been circulating through the county regarding the Duke's growing attachment to the elder Ashford girl. Margaret dressed carefully that evening, choosing a gown of deep green that Louisa had insisted suited her far better than the plain grays and browns she usually favored. Louisa herself fussed over her sister's hair with unusual attention, weaving a simple ribbon through the dark curls with careful fingers. "You look lovely," Louisa said, studying her reflection in the mirror. "Truly, Margaret, I do not know why you have hidden yourself away in plain colors for so long." "I did not think it mattered much how I dressed," Margaret admitted. No one was looking closely enough to notice the difference. "Someone is looking now," Louisa said, with a small knowing smile, and Margaret felt the familiar warmth rise in her cheeks at the reminder of exactly who that someone was. The Coldwell house was already crowded with guests by the time the Ashford carriage arrived, candlelight spilling from every window, music drifting out into the cold evening air. Margaret spotted Edmund almost immediately, standing near the fireplace in quiet conversation with Mr. Coldwell, and felt her heart quicken at the sight of him, dressed in dark evening clothes that made his tall frame seem even more imposing against the crowded room. He caught her eye across the space and offered the smallest of nods, a gesture so subtle that no one else in the room seemed to notice it, and yet it carried more warmth than any of Henry Coldwell's elaborate bows had ever managed to convey. The evening proceeded pleasantly enough at first, with cards and conversation and the usual pleasantries exchanged among neighbors who had known one another for years. Margaret found herself seated near the Duke during supper, a arrangement she suspected was no accident, given the careful way Mrs. Coldwell had organized the placements, likely eager to observe firsthand the rumors she had surely heard from every corner of the county. It was during the dancing that followed supper that the evening took its unfortunate turn. Margaret had just finished a set with an elderly gentleman from the parish, a kind but tedious partner who spoke at length about his gout, when Henry Coldwell approached her directly, his expression carrying the particular confidence of a man who believed himself the center of every room he entered. "Miss Ashford," he said, bowing with exaggerated formality, "I understand congratulations may soon be in order. The whole county speaks of little else besides your arrangement with the Duke." Margaret stiffened, recognizing immediately the cruel undertone beneath his polite words. "I am not aware of any arrangement, Captain Coldwell, beyond a shared interest in estate matters." "Of course," Henry said, his smile widening in a way that made Margaret's stomach tighten with unease. "Estate matters. How very practical of His Grace, to find such use for you, given that other attributes seem to have escaped his notice entirely." Several nearby guests had begun to turn toward the exchange, drawn by the sharpness in Henry's tone, and Margaret felt the familiar heat of public humiliation beginning to rise in her chest, the same helpless shame she had felt on the night he first humiliated her, months before. She opened her mouth to respond, though she was not entirely certain what she meant to say. "I confess I find your comment curious, Captain Coldwell," a voice said from just behind her, calm and precise, and Margaret felt a wave of relief wash through her, as Edmund stepped forward to stand at her side. "Given that Miss Ashford's understanding of estate matters has proven considerably more useful to me than the flattery I encounter in most drawing rooms." Henry's confident smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly. "I meant no offense, Your Grace. Only that Miss Ashford has always struck the county as a practical sort of woman, sensible, useful, as you say." "You mistake practicality and sense for shortcomings," Edmund said, his voice carrying easily through the now quiet room, drawing the attention of nearly every guest present. "I have found in my experience that practicality and sense are considerably rarer qualities than charm, and infinitely more valuable in a companion for life. You would do well to remember that, Captain. the next time you consider which qualities in a woman deserve genuine admiration." The room had gone utterly silent now. Every guest turned toward the small tableau near the dance floor, and Margaret could see Louisa watching from across the room, her expression caught somewhere between horror and delight at the public unfolding of exactly the reckoning Margaret had never dared to imagine. "I meant no disrespect toward Miss Ashford," Henry said, his composure clearly cracking under the weight of so many watchful eyes. "I only observed." "You observed nothing worth repeating," Edmund cut in, his tone still perfectly calm, though the steel beneath it was unmistakable now. "I recall, quite clearly, an evening some months ago when you saw fit to humiliate Miss Ashford in front of this very same gathering of neighbors, declaring in front of 200 witnesses that she meant nothing to you. I wonder, Captain, whether you have considered how thoroughly that moment revealed your own character, rather than hers." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Margaret watched, almost disbelieving, as the color drained from Henry's face. She had spent months believing herself the sole owner of that humiliation, carrying it privately, quietly, never imagining that anyone else in the room had considered it worth remembering, let alone worth defending her against, months later, in front of the very same audience. "I was young and foolish," Henry said, attempting to recover some measure of dignity. "Words spoken in a moment's carelessness." "Words reveal character precisely because they are spoken carelessly," Edmund replied. "A man who is careful only in front of witnesses, and cruel when he believes himself unobserved, has told you everything you need to know about the quality of his heart." He turned then, deliberately, offering Margaret his arm. "Miss Ashford, I believe this next set is promised to me." Margaret took his arm, her hand trembling slightly, though whether from the shock of the confrontation, or the sudden rush of gratitude, and something closer to love, she could not entirely say. As they moved toward the dance floor, leaving Henry standing alone amid the murmuring crowd, she caught sight of Louisa's face, bright with unmistakable satisfaction, and beside her, Mrs. Ashford, whose expression had shifted, quite suddenly, from confusion to something that looked remarkably like calculation. Across the room, Margaret noticed Henry Coldwell retreating toward a group of gentlemen near the card tables, his earlier confidence entirely deflated, his attempts at conversation met with polite but distant responses. It seemed the assembled guests had drawn their own conclusions from the confrontation, and few of them appeared inclined to offer him the easy admiration he had grown accustomed to receiving. Margaret felt no particular satisfaction in his discomfort, only a quiet sense of relief that the humiliation she had carried alone for so many months had finally, publicly, been set right. The music began again, and Edmund led her through the steps of the dance with the same quiet composure he brought to everything, though Margaret noticed his hand tighten slightly around hers whenever their path brought them close together. "You did not need to do that," she said softly, as the dance allowed a moment of closer conversation. "I have grown accustomed to enduring such comments quietly." "You should not have had to grow accustomed to it at all," Edmund replied, his voice low, meant only for her. "No one should learn to endure cruelty as though it were simply the price of existing in a room full of people too shallow to recognize genuine worth when it stands directly in front of them. You embarrassed him thoroughly, in front of the entire gathering." "He embarrassed himself, months ago, when he first chose cruelty over kindness," Edmund said. "I only ensured the county remembered it as clearly as you have been forced to remember it every day since." The dance continued, and though whispers still circulated through the room, Margaret found she no longer cared what any of them said. For the first time since that terrible night, months before, she felt the humiliation lifting from her shoulders entirely, replaced by something steadier, something that felt remarkably like being seen, truly seen, by someone whose opinion mattered more to her than the collective judgment of an entire county. When the dance ended, Edmund did not immediately release her hand, and for a moment they simply stood together at the edge of the dance floor, the noise of the party continuing around them, neither of them quite ready to rejoin the ordinary rhythm of the evening. "I have something I wish to say to you," Edmund said quietly, "though I do not believe a crowded ballroom is the proper place for it." "Then perhaps," Margaret said, her heart racing with anticipation she could barely contain, "we might find somewhere quieter." Before they reached the terrace, Louisa intercepted them, her face flushed with excitement she did not bother to hide. "Margaret," she said, taking her sister's free hand for a brief moment, "I have never seen anything so satisfying in my entire life." Henry looked as though he wished the floor might open beneath him. "It was not my intention to embarrass him so publicly," Margaret said, though she could not entirely suppress the small, private satisfaction the confrontation had given her. "He embarrassed himself," Louisa said, echoing Edmund's earlier words. You need not feel any guilt over it, Margaret. I only wish I had defended you so plainly, months ago, instead of standing beside him while he said such cruel things. You did not know better then, Margaret said gently. None of us did. Louisa squeezed her hand once more before stepping back, allowing them to continue toward the terrace, though not before casting a knowing glance between her sister and the Duke that suggested she understood precisely what conversation was likely to follow. Mrs. Ashford, meanwhile, had positioned herself near enough to overhear fragments of the confrontation, and Margaret caught sight of her mother's expression shifting through several stages of realization as the true weight of the evening settled over her. The daughter she had so long considered plain and unremarkable, destined at best for a quiet, sensible marriage to some equally unremarkable gentleman, had just been publicly, deliberately defended by one of the most eligible men in the county, in front of witnesses who would surely carry the story to every drawing room within 20 miles by morning. Margaret, her mother said, catching her arm briefly as she passed, her voice carrying none of its usual sharpness. I believe I owe you an apology, though I confess I do not yet know precisely what for. Margaret paused, startled by the unexpected softness in her mother's tone. There is no need, Mother. Not tonight, at least. Perhaps not tonight, Mrs. Ashford agreed, releasing her arm, though her expression remained thoughtful, uncertain, entirely unlike the confident, calculating woman Margaret had known her entire life. But perhaps soon. Margaret did not have time to consider her mother's words further, as Edmund's hand remained steady at her elbow, guiding her gently but purposefully toward the terrace doors once more. Behind them, the party had resumed its usual rhythm, though Margaret could feel dozens of eyes still following their progress across the room, curious whispers trailing in their wake like the last notes of a song that refused to fade entirely. Near the terrace doors, they passed Mr. Coldwell, Henry's father, who offered Edmund a brief, uncomfortable nod, clearly aware of what had transpired between his son and the Duke only minutes before. Edmund returned the nod with perfect composure, betraying nothing of the sharp words he had spoken only moments earlier, and Margaret found herself admiring once again the particular quality of his self-possession, the way he could move so effortlessly between quiet confrontation and calm civility, without ever losing his footing in either. The cold air struck her the moment they stepped outside, sharp and bracing after the crowded warmth of the ballroom, and Margaret pulled her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as they walked toward the stone balustrade at the edge of the terrace. Below them, the garden stretched out dark and frost-touched beneath a clear winter sky, scattered stars visible now that the clouds had finally cleared. Your mother looked rather stunned, Edmund observed, a faint trace of amusement in his voice. I believe the entire evening has rather stunned everyone, Margaret said, myself included. I did not plan such a public confrontation, he admitted. I had intended only to correct Captain Coldwell's poor manners with a few quiet words. But once I began speaking, I found I could not stop myself from saying everything I have wished to say to him since the night of the Fenwick ball. I am grateful you did not stop yourself, Margaret said, though I confess I will need some time to grow accustomed to being defended so thoroughly, in front of so many witnesses. Then I shall simply have to give you a great deal of practice, Edmund said, and there was a warmth in his voice now that Margaret had rarely heard from him. A lightness that seemed to belong entirely to this quiet, private moment, rather than to the guarded, dutiful man the county believed him to be. I find I have very little patience remaining for watching you endure unkindness in silence, Margaret, whether from Captain Coldwell or from anyone else foolish enough to underestimate you. You make it sound as though you intend to make a habit of defending me, she said, a small, hopeful smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite the cold. I do, he said simply, and the directness of the answer left her momentarily breathless. If you will permit me the privilege of it. You will have all the time you need, Edmund said, his voice growing quieter, more serious, though I hope, Margaret, that you will not need very much of it before you understand exactly why I felt compelled to speak as I did. He led her toward the terrace doors, much as she had once fled toward them alone, months before, seeking escape from her own humiliation. This time, she walked toward them with someone at her side, someone who had just publicly, deliberately, unmistakably chosen her in front of the very same room that had once watched her be discarded. Behind them, the party continued, the music swelling once more, but neither Margaret nor Edmund looked back, already anticipating the conversation that waited for them in the cold, quiet dark beyond the terrace doors, where everything that remained unspoken between them might finally, at last, be given words. The terrace stretched quiet and cold beneath the winter stars, the noise of the party fading behind them as Edmund led Margaret toward the same stone balustrade where they had stood only moments before. He stopped there, releasing her arm gently, and turned to face her directly, his expression carrying none of the careful composure he wore for the rest of the world. "Margaret," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice, stripped entirely of formality now, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold night air. "I have spent a great many years believing myself unsuited to this particular kind of happiness. After Charlotte, I convinced myself that duty and distance were the safest way to move through the world, that allowing anyone close enough to matter would only invite disappointment I could not afford to endure a second time. And now?" Margaret asked softly. "Now I find myself standing on a terrace, in the cold, unable to think of a single reason to maintain that distance any longer." He reached for her hand, holding it carefully between both of his own, as though it were something precious he feared might slip away. "You have never once asked me to be anything other than exactly who I am, Margaret. You have never flattered me, never performed for me, never pretended to be impressed by my title, when you clearly valued my honesty far more. I do not believe I have ever known anyone quite like you." Margaret's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "I have never known anyone like you either, Edmund. You were the first person, in longer than I can remember, to look at me and see something worth valuing, rather than something to be overlooked in favor of someone brighter." "You were never meant to be overlooked," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I do not understand how anyone in your life failed to see that sooner, but I intend to spend a great deal of time correcting the error, if you will allow me." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Margaret felt her breath catch entirely as he opened it to reveal a simple gold ring, set with a single dark stone that caught the starlight faintly. "I am not a man who offers pretty speeches easily," he said, "and I suspect you would think less of me if I tried. So I will simply say what I mean, as plainly as I know how. I love you, Margaret Ashford. I love your careful mind and your quiet strength, and the particular way you refuse to let cruelty define you, even when the whole world seems determined to make you small. I do not wish to spend another season pretending that my visits are only about boundary surveys and old family papers. I wish to marry you, if you will have me, not out of convenience, and certainly not out of pity, but because I cannot imagine building the rest of my life alongside anyone else." For a moment, Margaret could not find her voice at all, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was offering her, the sheer unexpected wonder of being chosen so completely, so deliberately, by a man who had never once pretended to feel more than he truly did. "Yes," she said finally, the word emerging soft but certain. "Yes, Edmund, I will marry you." His composure broke then, entirely, a genuine smile spreading across his face as he slid the ring onto her trembling finger before drawing her carefully into his arms. Margaret leaned into him, feeling the steady warmth of him against the cold night air, and thought, with a kind of quiet astonishment, of how completely her life had changed since that terrible evening months before, when Henry Coldwell's cruel words had seemed like the end of every hope she had ever allowed herself to hold. "I believe," Edmund murmured against her hair, "that Captain Coldwell may find himself with considerably more to regret than a single evening's poor manners." Margaret laughed softly, the sound carrying out into the cold, quiet garden. "Let us not waste another thought on him tonight. I find I have far better things to think about." They remained on the terrace a while longer, talking quietly of the future, of the wedding that would need arranging, of the life they intended to build together at Yardworth Hall, before finally returning to the warmth of the ballroom, where Louisa spotted the ring almost immediately, and could not suppress a small, delighted gasp that drew several curious glances in their direction. News of the engagement spread through the county with remarkable speed, and Margaret found herself, in the weeks that followed, the unlikely subject of considerably more admiration than she had ever received in her life. The same women who had once whispered doubts about the Duke's peculiar attention to the plain Ashford sister now competed eagerly for invitations to the wedding, their earlier judgments quietly forgotten in the face of Margaret's new and undeniable position. Mrs. Ashford, true to her earlier promise, offered Margaret a genuine apology in the days that followed, admitting with unusual humility that she had spent far too many years measuring her daughters against each other, favoring beauty over the quieter, steadier qualities that had ultimately secured Margaret's happiness. Margaret accepted the apology graciously, though she could not entirely forget the years of careless comparison that had shaped so much of her early life. Still, she found herself unwilling to hold on to old grievances when so much genuine happiness lay ahead of her. Louisa, for her part, had quietly ended her association with Henry Coldwell in the weeks following the confrontation at the Coldwell house, informing her mother with unusual firmness that she had no interest in marrying a man who revealed such shallow cruelty when he believed himself unobserved. Mrs. Ashford, chastened by the events of recent months, did not press the matter, and Louisa seemed, if anything, considerably lighter for having freed herself from an attachment that had never truly suited her. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Margaret found herself busier than she had ever been in her life, caught between the practical demands of preparing to manage a household considerably larger than her mother's modest estate, and the constant stream of visitors eager to congratulate her on a match no one had predicted only months before. She bore it all with the same quiet composure that had first caught Edmund's attention, though she confessed to Louisa, late one evening, that she sometimes still expected to wake and discover the entire engagement had been nothing more than an especially vivid dream. "It is not a dream," Louisa assured her, sitting cross-legged on Margaret's bed in a manner their mother would have scolded her for only months before, "though I confess I understand why it feels that way. You have spent so many years believing yourself unworthy of genuine happiness that accepting it now must feel almost frightening." "It does," Margaret admitted, "though not so frightening that I would wish to turn back." "I should hope not," Louisa said, laughing. "Edmund would be devastated, and Mother would never recover from the scandal of a broken ducal engagement." Her smile softened. "I am truly happy for you, Margaret. I know I have said it before, but I do not think I can say it often enough. You deserve every bit of this happiness, and more besides." Margaret reached over and squeezed her sister's hand, grateful beyond measure for the friendship that had grown between them in the months since that terrible night at the Fenwick ball, a closeness she had never expected to find with the sister she had once believed entirely absorbed in her own reflection. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked, "with Henry gone from your prospects and half the county already speculating about your own future?" Louisa shrugged, though there was something thoughtful behind the careless gesture. "I find I am in no particular hurry to marry anyone at all, at least not yet. I would rather wait for a man who sees me as clearly as Edmund sees you, than settle for the first charming face that happens to smile in my direction." She paused. "I learned that lesson rather thoroughly, I think, watching you these past months." The days passed quickly after that, filled with fittings and correspondence, and the countless small details that accompanied a wedding of such consequence. Mrs. Ashford, to Margaret's continued surprise, threw herself into the preparations with genuine enthusiasm, her earlier calculating ambitions for Louisa replaced by a sincere, if occasionally overwhelming pride in Margaret's approaching marriage. She spoke often, in those final weeks, of how proud Margaret's father would have been, had he lived to see his elder daughter so deservedly honored, and Margaret found she could forgive her mother's earlier failings more easily than she once believed possible, understanding at last that Mrs. Ashford's blindness had come from her own limited understanding of what truly mattered, rather than any deliberate cruelty toward the daughter she had so often overlooked. The wedding took place in early spring, at the small parish church nearest Yardworth Hall, attended by nearly every family of consequence in the county, all of them eager to witness the union that had, only months before, seemed so thoroughly unlikely. Margaret wore a simple gown of pale blue, her hair adorned with fresh flowers rather than elaborate jewels, and as she walked toward Edmund at the altar, she caught sight of Louisa in the front pew, tears of genuine happiness shining in her eyes. Edmund watched her approach with an expression of such open, unguarded warmth that Margaret nearly forgot the assembled crowd entirely, her attention fixed solely on the man who had seen her worth from across a crowded ballroom, on a night when the rest of the world had seen nothing but a woman easily discarded. "You mean everything to me," he said quietly, as she reached his side, echoing, deliberately, the cruel words that had once threatened to define her, transforming them entirely into something new, something true. Margaret felt tears gather in her own eyes, though they carried none of the pain of that earlier evening, only the overwhelming relief and joy of finally, completely, being chosen exactly as she was. The ceremony proceeded as such ceremonies always did, vows exchanged, rings blessed, the small parish church filled with quiet murmurs of approval from the assembled guests. But for Margaret, the moment that mattered most had already passed, spoken quietly between them at the altar, a private echo of everything they had built together since that first fateful night at the Fenwick ball. Afterward, at the wedding breakfast held in the great hall of Yardworth Hall, Margaret found herself seated beside her new husband, surrounded by the same county families who had once dismissed her so easily, now offering their warmest congratulations with what seemed, at least in some cases, genuine sincerity. She accepted their well wishes graciously, though she found her attention returning, again and again, to Edmund beside her, to the quiet, steady warmth of his presence, so different from the cold reputation that had once preceded him everywhere he went. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked her quietly, during a rare lull in the festivities, his hand finding hers beneath the table. None, Margaret said, without hesitation. I regret only that it took so long for either of us to understand what we might mean to each other. I do not consider it wasted time, Edmund said. I believe I needed those quiet months of boundary surveys and careful conversation to understand exactly what kind of woman I was falling in love with. Had I proposed too hastily, I might never have learned the full measure of your strength, your patience, your remarkable capacity to endure cruelty without ever allowing it to diminish you. Margaret squeezed his hand beneath the table, grateful beyond words for the strange, unlikely path that had led her from that terrible night in the ballroom to this one, surrounded by warmth and celebration, and a husband who valued her exactly as she was, without pretense, without performance, without the constant comparison to a sister who had once seemed to eclipse her entirely. As the celebration continued around them, Margaret allowed herself, finally, to release the last remnants of the old hurt she had carried since that terrible evening months before. Henry Coldwell's cruel words no longer had any power over her, transformed entirely by everything that had followed, by the quiet, deliberate love of a man who had watched her walk away from public humiliation with her chin held high, and had decided, in that single moment, that she was worth knowing. She had entered that ballroom, months before, believing herself invisible, overlooked, destined always to stand in her sister's shadow. She left it now, in the warm spring sunlight of her own wedding day, as the Duchess of Yardworth, chosen deliberately, completely, by a man who had never once pretended to feel anything other than exactly what he meant. Later that afternoon, as the wedding breakfast wound toward its close and guests began to take their leave, Margaret slipped away briefly to the quiet garden behind the great hall, seeking a moment's stillness amid the day's overwhelming joy. She found Edmund had followed her, as she somehow knew he would, his formal wedding coat replaced already by something more comfortable, his expression relaxed in a way she suspected few people beyond herself had ever witnessed. I half expected to find you hiding from your own celebration, he said, coming to stand beside her near the same stone balustrade where he had once proposed, months before, though this garden belonged now to both of them equally. Not hiding, Margaret said, only gathering myself. It has been a great deal of happiness to absorb in a single day. I understand the feeling, Edmund admitted. I have spent so many years guarding myself against exactly this kind of vulnerability, that even now, standing here as your husband, some small part of me still expects to wake and find it was only ever a very pleasant dream. Margaret smiled, recognizing her own words echoed back to her, though she suspected Louisa had said something similar to Edmund at some point during the preparations. The two of them united now in their shared affection for her. It is not a dream, she said, echoing Louisa's earlier reassurance. I am here. I am your wife. And I do not intend to let you retreat back into all that careful distance, whatever old habits might tempt you. I would not dream of it, Edmund said, drawing her gently into his arms. I have found something considerably better than distance, Margaret, and I have no intention of ever giving it up. They stood together in the quiet garden a while longer, the sounds of the departing wedding guests drifting faintly from the great hall behind them, the spring afternoon settling into a soft golden evening around them both. Margaret thought, as she rested against her husband's steady presence, of the long, difficult road that had brought her to this moment, from the humiliation of that first terrible evening, to the quiet, hard-won happiness she now held so completely in her hands. She thought of her father, who had never lived to see this day, but whose careful, thorough nature had first drawn Edmund's attention to her worth, through nothing more than old letters and forgotten boundary disputes. She thought of Louisa, transformed from a careless, self-absorbed girl into a genuine friend and ally, standing now somewhere inside the great hall, likely already fending off the curious questions of guests eager to speculate about her own future prospects. And she thought of her mother, changed slowly but genuinely by the events of the past months, learning at last to see her elder daughter clearly, rather than through the narrow lens of comparison that had shaped so much of Margaret's early life. Above all, she thought of Edmund, standing beside her now in the quiet garden, a man the county had once considered too cold, too guarded, too exacting to ever truly love anyone at all. She had seen past that careful reputation from the very first night, recognizing instead a man whose honesty ran deeper than any charm, whose steady, unflinching regard had offered her something no amount of empty flattery ever could. And that, Margaret understood, watching Edmund's steady, genuine smile across the quiet evening garden, was worth infinitely more than all the empty compliments in the world. 2 years passed at Yardworth Hall. and the great grey house that had once seemed so cold and formal to Margaret had transformed, slowly and completely, into something that finally deserved to be called a home. She stood now in the same library where Edmund had first spoken of Charlotte and his brother's death, though the room looked considerably different than it once had, warmed by fresh curtains and the addition of her own collection of books alongside his, the shelves no longer gathering dust but showing clear signs of frequent, careful use. She was reviewing correspondence from a tenant family on the northern boundary, a task that had become entirely her own in the years since her marriage, when Edmund entered, carrying their young daughter, barely a year old, against his shoulder with the same careful, unhurried competence he brought to everything else in his life. She would not settle for her nurse, he explained, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk. I believe she prefers your company to mine, though I cannot imagine why, given how much time I spend trying to win her favor. Margaret smiled, setting aside the tenant letters to reach for their daughter, small fingers immediately curling around her mother's own. She simply recognizes a soft heart when she sees one, whatever careful reputation you maintain in front of the rest of the county. My reputation for coldness has suffered considerably since our marriage, Edmund said, though there was no real complaint in his voice. I understand the local gossips have quite given up describing me as unapproachable, now that half the parish has witnessed me chasing after our daughter through the garden on more than one occasion. A great tragedy, I am sure, Margaret said, laughing softly, as their daughter tugged at a loose strand of her hair. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the housekeeper, announcing a visitor, and moments later Louisa swept into the library, her cheeks flushed from the cold outdoor air, her expression bright with the particular happiness Margaret had come to associate with her sister's visits over the past 2 years. I did not expect you until tomorrow, Margaret said, rising to embrace her. I could not wait another day, Louisa said. I have news, and I wish to tell you myself, rather than trust it to a letter. She glanced meaningfully at Edmund, who took the hint immediately, rising from his chair with their daughter still settled against his shoulder. I believe I shall take her to see the horses, he said, pressing a brief kiss to Margaret's cheek before departing, leaving the two sisters alone in the warm, book-lined room. Well, Margaret said, once the door had closed behind him, you look entirely too pleased with yourself for this to be ordinary news. Louisa could not suppress her smile any longer. Mr. Bennet has asked me to marry him. Margaret felt genuine delight rush through her at the news. Louisa had spent the past year in a quiet, unhurried courtship with William Bennet, a thoughtful, unassuming gentleman of modest fortune who had first caught her attention not with grand gestures or empty flattery, but with genuine conversation and careful attention, qualities Margaret suspected her sister had learned to value considerably more since the events of 2 years before. And what did you tell him? Margaret asked, though the answer was already plain in Louisa's radiant expression. I told him yes, of course, Louisa said, settling into the chair Edmund had just vacated. I do not believe I have ever been so certain of anything in my entire life. Well, he does not possess Henry's charm or his handsome face, but he has something considerably more valuable, Margaret. He listens. He asks after my thoughts and genuinely wishes to hear them. I do not believe I fully understood what that felt like until I watched you find it first, with Edmund. Margaret reached across the small distance between them to squeeze her sister's hand, remembering, as she often did, the long journey that had brought them both to this moment, so far removed from the painful evening that had once threatened to define them both. I am so happy for you, Margaret said. Truly, Louisa, you deserve exactly this kind of quiet, genuine happiness. As do you, Louisa said, glancing around the warm, comfortable library that had once seemed so cold and formal, back when Margaret's acquaintance with the Duke had been little more than a curious rumor circulating through the county. I confess I sometimes think of that terrible evening at the Fenwick ball, and I find myself grateful, in a strange way, that it happened at all. Had Henry never spoken so cruelly, had the Duke never noticed you across that crowded room, I do not know that either of us would have found our way to the happiness we know now. I would not wish to relive that particular evening, Margaret admitted, but I understand what you mean. It taught me a great deal, in the end, about the difference between charm and genuine worth. They spoke a while longer of wedding plans, of Louisa's hopes for a quiet ceremony far removed from the elaborate spectacle that had once seemed the only acceptable path for a young woman of the county, before Louisa finally rose to depart, promising to return within the week with William himself, eager for Edmund's approval of the match. As for Henry Coldwell, Margaret had heard little of him in the years since her wedding, save for occasional fragments of county gossip that reached her through the usual channels. He had married eventually, a young woman from a neighboring county with considerable fortune and, by all accounts, considerably less patience for his particular brand of shallow charm than Louisa had once shown. Margaret felt no particular satisfaction in the reports of his unhappy marriage, only a quiet, distant relief that she had escaped a life spent chasing the approval of a man who valued appearance over genuine substance. Later that evening, after Louisa's departure and their daughter had finally settled into sleep, Margaret found Edmund in the library once more, reviewing estate papers by the light of a single lamp. She settled into the chair across from him, watching the familiar, careful concentration on his face, the same expression she had first admired months before their engagement, when he had listened so intently to her explanations of old boundary disputes. "Louisa is to be married," she said, "to Mr. Bennet." Edmund looked up, genuine pleasure crossing his features. "That is welcome news. He seems a steady, sensible man, entirely unlike Captain Coldwell in every respect that matters." "She said something today that I have not been able to stop thinking about," Margaret said. "She said she was grateful, in a strange way, that Henry humiliated me at the Fenwick ball, because without it, neither of us might have found the happiness we know now." Edmund set his papers aside, giving her his full attention in the way she had come to treasure over the years of their marriage. "Do you share that sentiment?" Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not know that I would wish to relive that evening, even knowing where it eventually led, but I understand what she means. That single, cruel moment revealed something about Henry's character that spared me a lifetime of disappointment, had I continued believing his attentions meant something genuine. And it brought me to you, standing across that ballroom, watching me in a way no one ever had before." "I have never forgotten that moment," Edmund admitted, "watching you walk away from that humiliation with such quiet dignity, refusing to give any of them the satisfaction of your tears. I knew, even then, before I had spoken a single word to you, that I was watching someone remarkable." Margaret rose from her chair and crossed to sit beside him, resting her head against his shoulder in the comfortable silence that had become so familiar between them over the years. Outside, the winter stars had begun to emerge over the quiet fields of Yardworth Hall, the same fields where Edmund had once shown her the boundary disputes that first brought them together, now simply the familiar landscape of the life they had built, deliberately and completely, from the ashes of a single cruel evening that had once threatened to define her as nothing at all. She thought of Henry Coldwell's cruel words, spoken so carelessly in front of 200 witnesses, and understood now, with the clarity that only distance and happiness could bring, that he had been wrong in every possible way. She had never meant nothing. She had simply been waiting, all along, for someone capable of seeing exactly what she was worth, and choosing her, deliberately and completely, exactly as she was. Their daughter stirred faintly through the small monitor bell connected to the nursery above, and Margaret rose to check on her, Edmund following close behind, his hand finding hers as they climbed the stairs together. They found the child settled again, her small breathing steady and calm, and stood together a moment in the soft nursery candlelight, watching her sleep with the particular quiet wonder that had never entirely faded, even after a year of parenthood. "I hope," Margaret said softly, "that she grows up never doubting her own worth, the way I once did." "She will not," Edmund said, with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything he believed. "She has a mother who understands exactly what it costs to be underestimated, and who will never allow anyone to make her feel small for qualities that deserve admiration rather than dismissal. And a father," Margaret added, "who taught me that honesty and steadiness matter far more than charm, whatever the rest of the world might believe." They returned downstairs eventually, though neither felt any particular urgency to end the quiet evening, content simply to sit together near the fire, speaking of small things, of Louisa's coming wedding, of the spring planting soon to begin across the estate, of the small, ordinary pleasures that had come to define their life together far more than any grand romantic gesture ever could. Margaret thought, as the fire burned low and the house settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, of how thoroughly her life had changed since that terrible evening at the Fenwick ball, 2 years before. She had entered that ballroom believing herself invisible, destined to spend her life in her sister's shadow, valued by no one beyond her usefulness with household accounts and family correspondence. She had left it, eventually, as the Duchess of Yardworth, wife to a man who valued her mind above her appearance, mother to a daughter who would never know the particular pain of being overlooked in favor of someone brighter. Henry Coldwell's cruel words had once seemed like the end of every hope she dared to hold. In the end, they had been nothing more than the beginning of a story, considerably better than anything she could have imagined for herself, back when she still believed her own worth depended on the opinion of a man who had never truly deserved her attention at all. The fire burned down slowly, and outside, the winter stars continued their steady watch over Yardworth Hall, over the quiet, hard-won happiness that had grown, deliberately and completely, from a single moment of cruelty transformed, at last, into something considerably stronger and more lasting than anyone in that crowded ballroom could ever have predicted.